About to get real. Cash Flow King with you today, and in today's episode we have Trump accounts are mostly dog shit and the $2.4 million failure. Thanks for tuning into the show. As always, we really appreciate it. I know it's been a minute. Have you missed us? We've missed you guys. But as we always like to say, we don't want to put out a show just for the sake of putting out a show. There have been a few things that have come up, and I thought, well, that's not enough to do a show. That's not enough to do a show. So I may start doing what I'm going to do today and just combine a couple of shorter topics into one episode. And so that's what we're going to do here. Before we get into that, it's looking like we are now in a total of 83 countries, 1,186 cities, and we appreciate everybody. So thanks for tuning into the show, and thanks for your patience on waiting for today's episode. All right, so I was at a conference not too long ago, and there were a couple things that surfaced there that I thought would be interesting and possibly podcast worthy. And so we're going to talk about those today. The first one, which was kind of funny, there was a gentleman there who was very deeply rooted into all things politics, basically, and we don't get into politics on this show, but he wanted to present at the conference and kind of the state of where things are and based on different policies and whatnot. And there was a slide at the end of the presentation titled Investor Strategies, and I think this was partly a joke, but I couldn't help but take a picture of it. And the last bullet point on his slide said, one investor strategy was make babies and max fund Trump account. And I just started laughing. I thought that was hilarious. And prior to this, maybe because I live under a rock, I don't know, I'd not really heard all that much about said Trump account. But since then, I've done a little bit of digging and read a few things. I am first to tell you I'm not an expert in Trump accounts at all, nor would I want to be, given the fact that I think they're pretty shitty. And I'll tell you why here momentarily. But it was something that piqued my interest a little bit. So for those of you that have never heard of a Trump account, we're going to get into that a little bit right now on today's episode. So basically, what the hell is a Trump account? And, how does this potentially apply to you? And there's going to be some people where basically this does not apply to you whatsoever, but there's others where it may apply or may apply to you in the future potentially if you're planning on having a child or children. So basically it is a tax-advantaged, quote-unquote, I'll put that in quotes, a tax-advantaged account for children. So it's basically a government-backed investment account, and this essentially is coming into play as a result of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OBBBA, and sometimes I guess these are being referred to also as the baby bonus Trump accounts. Hence the presenter's thing about make babies and max fund Trump accounts, I guess. So this was, signed into law on July 4th of this year, and basically any child under the age of 18 that's a U.S. citizen with a social security number could be eligible for one of these types of accounts. And specifically where I think, quite frankly, spoiler alert, the only, based on what I know about it so far, and my mind and opinion could change on this, I don't think it will, but the only reason that I would consider personally opening up one of these next year is for the seed money. So if you had a child or children born between January 1st of this year and 2025, and or you will have a child born all the way up until December 31st of 2028, I believe it is, then the federal government will pretty much give you a one-time $1,000 contribution to this account as seed money. That would be the only instance where I would consider opening it. I'll talk about why here as we continue. But basically, yeah, you never want to turn down free money. So that's going to come into play. Technically, employers also will be able to make contributions to these accounts. I think their cap is about $2,500, and I don't know how many employers will do that or not. Some people are saying that this could be a nice retention benefit and sort of not really employee appreciation, but to get talent to stay at the organization, if they were to make a deposit into, one of these accounts. But then you get into the whole thing of, well, you have two identical employees and one has children and one doesn't have children, and then, is that discrimination? And you can go down the rabbit hole on that. All right, that's for another day, I guess. So who knows how widely adopted that will be and how many employers will actually contribute to these accounts, but it is possible. And then basically the money in these accounts has to be invested in either a mutual fund or ETF. It sounds like it's going to be a pre-approved list of different types of funds and fund structures where the expenses are very low, less than 10 basis points or 0.1%. And so it's not something where you're going to be able to like go into the account and buy CDs or keep the money in cash or have an overly conservative bond portfolio, quite frankly, which is a good thing, because especially if somebody were to start one of these when the kid is just born and they can't touch the money typically until at least age 18, and in some cases a lot of the funds are going to remain in there even longer than that, then yeah, you probably don't want some of those other investments in that account based on the time horizon there. You probably want something a little bit more aggressive on the stock or equity side. So I think they got that part right. Parents or whomever wants to can contribute, I believe, a total of $5,000 per year. And again, the funds typically can't be touched until age 18. So all that sounds good so far. And, so far, not knowing anything else, I'd say, yeah, all right, maybe I'm on board with this. This sounds like a cool thing. But then when you get into how the funds are taxed and how the funds are able to come out or not come out, I think that, there's a lot to be desired here. In fact, even I was reading an article here from the Tax Foundation, taxfoundation.org. This is from about a little over a week ago, maybe closer to 2 weeks ago now, on July 18th, titled "Trump Accounts Could Be Better, and Here's How." And they go through some different things. But basically, the treatment, if you will, of your contributions, they're going in after taxes, kind of like a Roth IRA. Nothing wrong with that necessarily. However, the funds, when they come out, are going to be taxed, it seems like, at ordinary income, which is going to be somewhat similar to how a traditional IRA would be treated. And anybody that knows anything about non-retirement investing, which quite frankly is probably not most people, because most people are just struggling to, it seems like make it from paycheck to paycheck these days. And if they're lucky, they're able to squirrel a little bit away into a retirement plan. But for those that are familiar with or do any sort of non-retirement investments, hopefully, that those investments are typically subject to what many would consider to be more favorable tax rates. And what I'm referring to here is long-term capital gains rates, as well as qualified dividends, which are typically taxed as long-term capital gains as well. And generally, again, it's going to vary for everybody, but a good rule of thumb, if you will, is that ballpark, those rates for most people, in some cases they can be zero, but we're going to skip over that for today, but for most people is about half of what the ordinary income rates would be. So you don't get that sort of tax treatment with these Trump accounts. It's coming out as ordinary income, right? So you're effectively, even though the benefit obviously is that, like a traditional IRA, the funds, while they're in there grow tax deferred. That's a good thing. However, when the funds come out, they're going to come out at ordinary income. Now, that may or may not be a big deal depending on when the funds come out and the tax situation at that time. But just as a general rule of thumb, the capital gains rates are way more favorable from a tax standpoint versus the ordinary income rates. And then you have to couple that with, okay, well, how long is the money going to be in this account? We know at least 18 years. How much money is going to actually flow into this account, and what kind of gains are we going to have, which, again, nobody knows exactly what that's going to look like. But you can make an argument that the more money that goes into an account like this and the longer that the money is held in an account like this, the larger the benefit of the tax deferral while the funds are in that account. But with that said, if I get a little bit geeky and technical here, if you think about the type of funds that these assets in these Trump accounts can be invested in, right? Things like an S&P 500 index fund or some equivalent of that, right? At a very low expense ratio, which are all great things, typically is not going to spin off a large dividend, right? It's mostly going to be, long-term gains in that account or capital appreciation, hopefully, in that account. And so the tax deferral component in and of itself really could be negligible, is what I'm trying to say, which would be very different than if you had other types of investments, fixed income investments, bond investments that had interest income that would normally be taxed at ordinary income, and you could defer that instead. Then I think the Trump accounts and the tax deferral on those types of accounts become all that much more powerful. It's beyond the scope of today's podcast episode, and quite frankly, I don't remember if we've done one on this or not, but a lot of folks will talk about in our industry not only asset allocation, but asset location. And based on the types of accounts that you have, you may want to hold certain types of assets in certain types of accounts. So for example, your more growth-oriented investments would generally be held in a non-retirement account or potentially even in a Roth IRA, for example. Whereas your maybe not so tax-favored investments that throw off a lot of ordinary income or interest income, which is typically taxable at ordinary income, maybe you want that in a traditional IRA vehicle where that's going to be deferred. Because if it's going to be taxed at ordinary income anyway, put it in a vehicle that's going to allow you to defer that and go from there. Don't put it in a taxable account where you're going to get nailed every single year. So I'm probably getting a little bit too far in the weeds right now, so we'll take a step back. But basically, I guess what I'm trying to say is these Trump accounts are going to have growth-oriented, stock-like investments that don't throw off a lot of dividend yield typically. Therefore, the tax implications while the money's in the account are going to be negligible. So the tax deferral benefit in and of itself with the Trump account is immaterial. And essentially, I would much rather have the money in a taxable brokerage account where the taxes, when it comes time to pay them, are typically going to be about half. And not only that, the flexibility, which is another huge component, is going to be way greater with just your typical standard non-retirement brokerage account. You can put in whatever you want, whenever you want, take it out whenever you want, buy and sell whenever you want, buy and sell whatever you want. You're not going to be limited, although I don't have any problem with the types of investments they're saying need to go into these Trump accounts. They keep it pretty straightforward, and that's fine, right? The other thing is, if it's truly going to be money that is going to be for the child for later, a lot of people are familiar with things like 529 college savings plans. And there was actually, I don't know if I have it here, was another article. I'd read several different articles on this. I think it was somebody from the Kitsis team that basically said, hands down, I'd rather have a 529 plan than one of these. And I would absolutely agree with that. Because again, with the 529 plan, think about your goals and objectives, right? In that case, it's typically going to be for college, although there's a lot of things and a couple of new things that came as a result of the OBBBA with reasons that you can use those 529 funds for what we call qualified expenses where the money comes out tax-free. That list got a little bit longer. And if you think about the goal, you're going to put money in typically for the child or grandchild or whomever for later. It's going to be in there for a while, right? You're probably going to have similar types of investments. However, the big difference is that on the Trump account, when you're taking it out, the gains are going to be taxed at ordinary income. With a 529, if you're taking it out for qualified expenses, it's going to be completely tax-free. That's a huge difference, right? Not only that, the amount of money in terms of contribution that can go into these types of accounts is going to be far greater with a 529. So right now, with these Trump accounts, you're looking at $5,000 a year. It's typically going to be indexed for inflation. With these 529 college savings plans, you're typically looking at a number that's in the multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars in terms of money in the account before pretty much you can't contribute anything additional to it. So there's really no annual limit per se, but different plans that are administered by different companies in different states are all going to have their own limit in terms of how much can be in that account from a contribution standpoint before they basically tell you you can't put anything else in there. And those numbers people generally almost never get to, unless you're doing some type of, Dynasty 529 planning for multi-generational stuff. And again, that's beyond the scope of today. But so the point is, if you're going to have the money in there, right, I think that both the 529 college savings plan, if the goal is for those types of expenses, wins because the gains are tax-free. And if you're not, and you want the money in there for whatever the fuck you want, if you want to buy a car for Junior, for example, right, I think the brokerage account wins because you have the utmost flexibility with when you take it out. You don't have to wait until a certain age. It doesn't have to be until age 18. In fact, quite frankly, and I'm probably imposing a little bit of my own personal thought process here and as a parent now, but I kind of sort of am a control freak in a way. And so for that reason, and for also the reason for financial aid and what used to be the FAFSA and all the other things, I don't want assets in the child's name necessarily, even if they're earmarked for the child. So I would rather have an account, for example, a brokerage account where the parent is listed on that account. And it's an asset, it's a parental asset at that point, which doesn't count as heavily against the child. And again, that's beyond the scope of today. But the point is, I can pull out whatever I want whenever I want, if depending on your state and when they get their license or whatever. Let's say they're 16 or 17 and you want to buy a vehicle. You don't have, you can take the money out of that account if that's what you want to do, and you don't have to wait for it. The money's not trapped until age 18 like this Trump account, not to mention it has to be used for certain types of expenses. Otherwise, you basically fall under the rules of how a traditional IRA is used and potential 10% penalties under 59.5 if it's not used for certain things. And then I think there's even a limit in there for you can only use, I think I had it here, I want to say it was up to 50% of the account at a certain age. Let me see if I can find that really quick. I'm not sure if I have it on this page or not. But there's all these different rules that basically just cloud things and make it unnecessarily complex, in my opinion. I think there's a lot of options out there, many of which can be used in conjunction with each other to effectively plan for your child or grandchild's, financial future. And I think that's cool. I don't necessarily think that this is one of them. And again, unless you're going just after the seed money, take your $1,000 and be done. And so there was another article on NPR that basically poses the question, how much could these accounts be worth in the future? And, basically they did a time value of money calculation. They used an 8% average annual rate of return and said, all right, if the government puts in $1,000 and you don't put anything else in, and on average you earn an 8% rate of return, 18 years later, how much is in the account? And the answer is a little bit shy of $4,000, which again is great in and of itself, but at the same time, is that life-changing money? I don't know. I don't think so, right? But if somebody put in the maximum, let's say $5,000 a year, and they did the same calculation and they maxed it out, well, the account would be worth almost $200,000, over $190,000 after 18 years of contribution. Okay, that's more meaningful. But again, it comes with a set of restrictions. And so I think if I'm thinking about this from a practical standpoint, and again, I'm still digesting a lot of this information, so maybe there's something that I'm overlooking here, and if that's the case and I change my tune later, I'll certainly come back on and let you guys know. But the way I'm thinking about it is, look, if your kiddo qualifies for the $1,000 of seed money, take it and just let it run, let it ride, and that's it, and do the other types of accounts instead, unless you are already essentially, quote-unquote, max funding college savings plans like 529s, which again, personally, I don't know that I would do. In fact, that's a fear of mine, is I don't want to have, quote-unquote, too much money in an account like that. Yes, there's the favorable 529 to Roth IRA, essentially rollover provisions that we talked about on a different show, and we're not going to get into the details of that here, but there is essentially a safety valve there for that, for a portion of the money. But you still don't want to have these things, in my opinion, overly funded. But if you are putting heavy dollars into 529s, and or you're putting heavy dollars into a brokerage account, and you just want an additional avenue, knowing that it comes with restrictions, but for whatever reason you feel like the tax deferral is worth it, or your employer is going to kick in up to that $2,500 for your kid, of course you're going to take the free money, and I wouldn't blame you. But what I wouldn't do is, hey, we didn't have a kid born between these years, so we don't get the $1,000 of seed money, and hey, my employer is not going to give me jack shit for my kid in this Trump account. What I wouldn't do is go up and open one from scratch and put in 5,000 or up to 5,000 of my own money. I just don't see the value there personally. Again, not advice, information, education, ideas. We don't give any advice on the show. Do your own due diligence, consult your own professionals. We're not your professional, even though I am a professional in the industry. This is just not something that I think is, I think it maybe was well-intentioned, but I think in practice it's going to be a big flop. But we'll see. We'll see how that works. I believe these start, and the $1,000 will automatically come into play in terms of deposits, I want to say beginning in the middle of 2026 from what I read. For those that want to start them up and open them up on your own, especially if you're not eligible for the seed money, I want to say that you can begin that. I want to say I read somewhere it was January 1st of 2026. At our firm, we've not really done a heck of a whole lot with this. There hasn't been a ton of info about it. Quite frankly, I don't think there's going to be, because it's really not, I mean, again, I don't think it's something that's going to be great for most people. And quite frankly, with the relatively low contribution limits and whatnot, I don't think a lot of companies are going to want to necessarily carry these things on the books if they don't have to, unless they're using that as a way to drive additional business and say, hey, well, you know, if we get the parents to open up a Trump account for the kiddo, and then the kiddo starts with us essentially from day one, and then when they get older, they're already going to have an account here, and maybe they want to do retirement accounts or other investments. Maybe that's their pitch or their play, and for those reasons, maybe they'll, you know, deal with the administrative burden and costs of keeping those accounts on the books. I don't know. But again, you know, the expenses on them and the fees are going to be extremely low, so I can't see this being a profit center for most firms. We'll see how things unravel. I'm sure we'll hear more and more about this as we get later into this year and certainly into 2026. But for now, those are my thoughts. I think they're mostly dog shit for most people. And again, if my tune changes on that, I'll certainly come back and let you guys know. The other thing I wanted to mention is actually at the same conference. There was a gentleman who was talking, just presenting to a bunch of advisors. He's pretty well known in the industry. He does very, very well for himself. He made it a point to get on stage and tell everybody how, you know, he views all of us as his competition and how he will outwork us. And it was, I don't think he meant for it necessarily to be condescending, but I certainly think it came off that way. He told everybody how he made, I think it was $2.4 million last year, and how he's going to outwork everyone, and he has a Ferrari and 3 Rolexes and all this stuff. And I couldn't help but sit in the audience and look at him and think to myself, wow, what a failure. Like, this guy sucks, you know? Because what about your personal life? You know, there's a lot of speculation out there, but word on the street is that his first wife got into, had a drug issue because he was never home. Guy works apparently 7 days a week. And he's on his either second or third marriage now, I believe. He was talking about how, you know, if he's at home with his wife and, you know, she's doing a crossword puzzle or whatever, and the phone rings at 8 o'clock at night, like, he's taking the call. And I think that some people would look at that and say, wow, what a great work ethic. I would look at that and say, wow, what about your wife? Like, spend some time with her, you know? And spend some time with your family. And so anyway, who am I to judge? You know, nobody. But I think that a lot of the newer advisors were looking at him as a way to, like, oh, that's what, you know, that's a success story, and that's what I want to be like, and that's how much money I want to make, and yada, 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 yada. But at the same time, you know, I would say that's not the case. You know, he made a comment, I could have retired 15 years ago. It's not about the money. And then he goes on to talk about all this financial shit, like how much money he made and all the stuff he has. And it's just like, all right, dude, like, good for you. But, you know, you failed personally. And then I had a conversation with somebody completely different event. I just so happened to be there. And I ran across a guy who actually worked a ton in his younger years to be able to have a family and do what he wants to do with that family in his older years. So, for example, he was telling me about how he was working anywhere from 2 to 4 jobs at one point in his life, and he was, you know, he had roommates. He was basically sleeping on a mattress on the floor. You know, but by the time he was, I think he said, if it was 30 years old, maybe, he had saved up like $600,000. and he was able to have the wedding that he wanted and put a large down payment on the house that he wanted, and his wife now gets to stay home. They have 2 little girls, and I asked him, I said, well, how did you guys meet? And come to find out, he shared with me a story about how they were both in AA and how they met through that. And I just thought it was a really interesting story, because we're talking about 2 completely different people that work in 2 completely different industries that make really 2 completely different amounts of money. The guy right now is making like $70,000 a year. It's like, how the hell do you live on $70,000 a year with a wife and 2 kids that stay at home with a big ass house? But the reason is because he sacrificed in the beginning. I thought it was extremely impressive that he was able to scrape together $600,000 by the time he was 30. I don't know anybody else really that's been able to do that, short of like, retirement accounts or whatever, but like putting together actual cash from working this job and that job and just, being super frugal. But he did that with a vision, and his dream was always to be able to have a family. And while he got started a little bit later with said family, he's able to do that now, and he's able to, he put them in a position where he can do that, and his family, he can take care of them. And I think that is way more admirable and more of a success story than the guy at the conference that made $2.4 million last year and is on his 2nd or 3rd marriage and works 7 days a week and just seemingly has no personal life. I think that's a fucking failure. So I just thought that was really, really interesting. I didn't think that, was enough to make an episode in and of itself, so I just kind of tacked it onto this one. But that's something that's been on my mind lately, and I think that, everybody approaches things differently. But I've had conversations with people where it's like, I could be offered a different position, and they could, double, triple, quadruple my income, which would be, on the one hand, great, but on the other hand, like, you get to a point where it doesn't even matter anymore, but you're going to be on the road all the time. Like, what about people that are traveling, so many weeks out of the year, and they're not able to spend the time with their family? It doesn't matter how much money somebody has. That's time that you're never going to get back. And so, as we all know, time is a very non-renewable resource, right? When it's gone, it's gone. And so I just think it's important to keep that in mind. And, it's just something that I wanted to add into this podcast. It's something I've been thinking a lot about lately. I think, everybody's definition of success is very, very different. But, I had a conversation with a coworker of mine, and he was going to meet with some big wig or whatever. And he, was kind of trying to figure out, okay, these are the types of questions they're going to ask me, this, that, or the other thing. And, one of them was about the definition of success. And I told him, I said, well, I don't know that I would necessarily give this answer to the big wig that you're meeting with. I said, but between me and you, I'll tell you straight up, my definition of success is being able to go to my daughter's swim lesson every week. Most of the time. I'd say 90+% of the time. Most people can't do that. So anyway, I think it's important for all of us to, you do what you got to do, right? Sometimes it's a grind. You got to put in the time. You got to put in the hours. You got to do what you got to do. I've been there as well. But just looking at those 2 stories and thinking back about that guy, I just really admire him for what he was able to do to set himself up for the future. And he did that for a period of time. And now he's able to reap the benefits of that versus the guy who works 24/7 for the sake of working and making money, but seemingly has no end goal in mind and just is kind of wasting, in my opinion, his life away. Working when he doesn't have to work, probably because he has nothing else in his personal life that he can do. And I'm not being a hater, right? I think it's great that he makes great money, but again, I would definitely take a fraction of that and be okay with that, knowing that I was able to spend time with my family. So anyway, all right, that's all I have for you guys today. Thanks for tuning in to Real Talk Personal Finance, and we will see you in the next episode.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.